Welcome to the Gaudium et Spes podcast, where every other week we bring you Catholic teachings and stories of faith from people throughout the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Now, here are your hosts, Suzanne McNinch and Chez Filippini.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Gaudium et Spes podcast. We are here today again with Dr. Luke Arredondo of the St. Brennan Center for Evangelization and Spirituality to continue our Catholic social teaching series, a series that becomes ever more relevant with every day that Pope Leo XIV is in office. And Luke, it's great to have you back, man.
Happy to be here. Looking forward. All we got to do is cover like 1,800 years. So. It's a piece of cake.
This might be the most ambitious episode in the midst of ambitious episodes of the history of Gaudium et Spes. The last episode of Gaudium et Spes was serendipitously or whatever, coincidentally, Bishop Bill covered the Council of Nicaea, which happened kind of in an era we're going to cover. In 325, we're going to be talking about the Church Fathers today. And the next episode is also going to be the Council of Nicaea. So we're deep in church history in these three episodes. And that's the way God planned it from all of eternity. And that's what we're going to discuss today. We got to catch up, though, a little bit. Luke, the first line from that beautiful document, the joys, the hopes, the griefs, and anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys, the hopes, griefs, and anxieties of the followers of Christ. It is the dog days of summer. Have you had any relief, any joys, hopes, griefs, anxieties in the midst of what's going on?
Yes. I always have griefs and anxieties about the Giants' performance in the early part of the season. They recently won 7 in a row and then somehow lost to the worst team in the league, couldn't sweep them. So I have that anxiety, that grief all summer. Maybe I get a little bit of joy out of it at the end if we get lucky. But I got to go to the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota just a couple of days ago. And I don't know what it's like living up there in the wintertime, but their summers are incredible. It was 60 degrees with a breeze. You could just walk for a couple of miles with dress like this and not sweat.
What?
So, in June. I didn't think that was allowed, so that was pretty cool. It was a beautiful campus. I was up there for a little short conference on kind of factors relating to both disenfranchisement from religion and also the factors that seem to play a big role in succeeding to pass faith down from one generation to the next. So very germane to the conversations in the diocese here about family catechesis. So hopefully some good can come from that. But yeah, the weather was unbelievable.
We're jealous of very few places except for this time of year. And Minnesota gets its 17 minutes in the limelight where it's actually the apple of the envy of the rest of the world. Man, that's cool. Yeah, it's been a really cool summer so far. We had a week-long trip down with family down to Melbourne. If you've listened to this podcast, I've probably talked about Melbourne in a dozen episodes or more at this point in time, but some good time with family. And, family beach nights on Sunday out on Pensacola Beach, trying to beat the heat. Definitely, if you're not from the area, you're moving in, don't discount going to the beach around sunset because you will, first of all, fight less traffic, have more access to bathrooms if you go to the right place, and then it will be 15 degrees cooler. So, summer's awesome.
I'll have to try that. My daughters keep wanting to go to the beach, and I just detest the idea of the beach. So I'm like, it's a hard sell to get me. So maybe in the evening. I haven't tried that.
Oh, man. That'd be a great thing to know. How many Floridians really just hate the beach? I think it's more than we think. There's dozens of you out there. All right, guys. Well, we're going to get into, again, we started this Catholic social teaching series some time ago, and we covered, Luke, you took us through what is the biblical vision of Catholic social teaching. This one we call it an ambitious episode because we're going to try and connect from the end of the canon of scriptures being solidified in the first century, maybe the first century, we're going to say it's that. And then we're going to go all the way to connect the bridge to where we're going to spend most of our time, which is modern Catholic social teaching, which starts with the beloved Leo XIII.
Sure. Yeah. So we got to get from the end of the scriptures being written to 1891.
That's right.
And actually, I mean, you said the end of the scriptures being codified, but we're not. That's after we start the episode, we get there at some point. So the way that I kind of thought of it in talking with you is Okay, well, we did a Bible episode, and we don't want to jump from the Bible all the way to 1891, but we're also, we don't have unlimited time. You can't do everything, but let's have one conversation at least about the way that the church really gives life to the biblical principles in a social environment. That's right. That's very different from how we think about the church's function or even its identity. So for today, I mean, in today's frame of mind, typical, even a religious person, I mean, we just do not think of the world and the church in the same way that the church did for so long. We think of them as very, very separate, very, very distinct, and certainly in most respects unrelated. And that's actually it's a pretty new way of looking at things. That's
right.
So we want to talk a little bit about kind of going from here's divine revelation, the canon of Scripture, even before it's a canon that's been promulgated and closed or whatever. Here's the New Testament, and then how did people live? And I think the Acts of the Apostles, like they held all things in common. They devoted themselves to the teaching, the teaching of the apostles, the breaking of the bread, and the prayers. That's consuming their entire life, right? And so we want to, I think, to kind of jump into it with talking about the patristic era, the era of the Church Fathers, which is, basically ends at the Council of Chalcedon in the 400s. So it's that era immediately after the death of Christ, people who were taught by the disciples, taught by the eyewitnesses, and then that continue to hand on and pass on their teachings. They wrote, but they also taught people. People lived with them. And we have a lot of different writings from, Church Fathers in different languages. There's Eastern Fathers and Western Fathers. And it is a time period that gives us some very critical things. And one of which is it shows us the way the Bible was read or interpreted. It may not have even been read. I don't know that a lot of the people were even literate, but here is something that stuck with me from when I was working on my master's degree at Notre Dame Seminary. The Church Fathers, if we only had their writings and we didn't have any manuscripts of the New Testament, we could recreate something like 96% of the New Testament just from their writings. Right? That's how much they're talking to us about the Bible, about the Scriptures. And so what they're trying to do, very obviously, is exhort people with the language of the Scriptures in a way that connects to the experience of their life and the world that they're living in. So it's applying the teaching of the Bible to living in the world. And from this, you could get an endless list of quotes about, this father said this about this particular thing that we might call Catholic social teaching. They didn't call anything that, right? But when you read the compendium, you'll see, frequently footnotes to different church fathers or quotations from the church fathers on various aspects of things. Fundamental things like the dignity of the human person, the universal destination of human goods, which I think a lot of people can think of as like, oh, that's something the church came up with when they wrote the compendium or whatever. It was a 20th century term, and it may be a 20th century term, but it's clearly a patristic idea, and it's not a patristic idea that came out of nowhere. It came out of the Scriptures. So that era moves the church forward in a really interesting way because they're teaching before there is even an easy way to get all of the Scriptures into one book and read it. There are primary witnesses to what was the impact of the Bible on the church.
And so you couple of great points there. Number one, the church fathers, if we think about what a desk looks like for a church father, they might have some precious copies of, who knows, maybe Plato or maybe the Neoplatonists, some of the commenters on Greek philosophy, essentially. Might have Philo or I don't know, who knows. But mainly, they got the Bible on their desk. And when they're writing about anything, and so it's somebody, we'll talk about Augustine. Augustine writes about the Trinity. He writes about the idea of predestination and faith and works and all these kinds. He also writes about that, and it's all sourced from. It's all just of a piece. Like you said, there's no categories. Like I'm going to do my little, I'm just going to write pure theology now, or now I'm going to write social teaching. No, it's like I'm bringing the Bible to bear into the world, and I'm just bringing Christianity in its full force, whether that's impacting kind of our eternal salvation in a sense, in a very specific way, or I'm talking specifically about how to treat the poor, how the state and the church interact. It's all just wringing out every last little droplet from the scriptures themselves.
Yeah. The allegorical reading of Scripture was. Some people today will say, that allegorical symbolic reading of Scripture, that's not a really good way to read the Bible. Mm-hmm. Well, the people that were closest to the time of the Bible, leaned in that way of reading the text. So
they were totally comfortable with that.
And they would have. These are people that some of them knew apostles, learned from them, remembered what they looked like and how they sat when they taught and where they sat when they told, these parables and stuff from the Bible, so I think it's the best way to read the scriptures. So we got a lot of ground to cover. Let me just give a couple of examples, particularly with respect to this concept that is very clearly in modern Catholic social teaching parlance. This is a social doctrine question, right? The universal destination of human goods. And the idea there is that in some way everybody is owed all of creation, and we are all just kind of sharing it. We do have ownership, but not in a sort of limiting fashion that it means nobody else has a right to it in some sort of way. And so this is Chrysostom. I love Chrysostom. This is a couple of examples. One, not to enable the poor to share in our goods is to steal from them and deprive them of life. The goods we possess are not ours, but theirs. This is in the 4th century. So when you have people that object to what the compendium calls the universal destination of human goods, it's it's some stupid 20th. No, man, that's how the saints understood the world to be. Go ahead.
And his audience, Chrysostom, for a brief moment, was named the Patriarch Archbishop of Constantinople, which would have been the richest city. It had surpassed Rome, old Rome by that time, and was the richest city it was the seat of the empire at that point in time in the end of the 390s. He is talking to the richest and most powerful people in existence. He hangs out with them every day. He goes to court and has meals with them. He eventually gets exiled by them. And he's saying, so this isn't some guy in random podunk France at the time or something like that.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I had no idea about that.
This is this is your Cardinal Archbishop of Silicon Valley.
Right, yeah. It's like Bishop Barron, giving a talk at Google.
Yep, exactly.
And warning about this or something, or giving a keynote at Apple or something. Another Chrysostom, the rich are in possession of the goods of the poor, even if they have acquired them honestly or inherited them legally. So just to real quickly, and I'm going to watch the clock on this, when Pope Francis, for instance, talks about the fact that environmental concerns are an issue not just for us right now, but that we can in some way steal from the future, steal something that children of the future deserve. He's not invoking some radical, weird environmentalist idea by saying it belongs in some sense to other people. I mean, he's in contact with Chrysostom here, right? The rich that do actually possess something legitimately, that they worked for it, they still have the goods of the poor. It means that they owe it in some way to them, and that the poor have a claim to it in some way. I mean, that's super challenging, but it's a very ancient idea, right? So we could really spend a whole hour just talking about various ways in which the church fathers kind of give us these indications, lay some foundations that we still talk about in Catholic social teaching, but of course we got to cover a lot of ground. But this is just a taste that, in the very earliest era, what we call social doctrine was being taught. It just wasn't being sort of parceled out as like, oh, hey guys, we're going to give you some social teaching now, so everybody listen.
This is probably a homily or maybe
Yeah.
a long,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, Chrysostom's homilies are awesome. If you haven't read his homily on parenting on Ephesians 6, it's really good. It's like 30 pages, but super, super good.
Can you imagine just being in the pew and then somebody says to you, you know, you're not nothing you have really belongs to you. And, you know, some priests do challenges, but I think the fathers were so strident in their challenging to the powerful at that point in time. You know, you want to call it speaking truth to power in some kind of trendy way. That's what they did. Okay.
Yes.
Take us through more here.
We'll do one more so we don't spend too long. So this is from St. Clement of Rome. Let the strong take care of the weak. Let the weak respect the strong. Let the rich man minister to the poor man. Let the poor man give thanks to God that he gave him one through whom his need might be satisfied. And this is really nice because it's giving us an early indication of like what St. Thomas Aquinas would call the differentiation of talents, abilities, and resources that is in some way natural to the human community, meaning that people will not all be wealthy. They're not all going to be poor. They're not all going to be talented or beautiful or, you know, intelligent. There's a diversity of human beings that inhabit various spectrums on the human scale in all of these areas. And what St. Clement of Rome here is showing is that if you are strong, you use that gift to help the weak. If you are rich, you should be inspired by virtue to use those riches to help the poor, and that the poor should not see themselves as being in some sort of combat or contest with the rich, or the weak in competition with the strong, but rather these are mutually beneficial things. And it doesn't mean that it's good to be poor in any sort of simplistic way, but that the poor person ought not to hate the rich person, and the rich person ought not to say, well, you're poor, you know, you got there yourself, you got there on your own, you have your own problems, I don't need to give you any of my money. It's a challenge to see a human community that supports itself, you know, in sharing of gifts and in receiving of gifts too. Poor people can benefit from the rich, and the rich can benefit from the poor. And this is something that you'll see, you know, I mean, Mother Teresa, for instance, in a more contemporary example, shows us some of this, you know, shows us some of the goodness of just being with someone in difficult moments. So the patristic era, you know, had, and I like the way that you said at the beginning, you know, it was a world that existed that's just different than the way we think of things. Social teaching was just kind of wrapped in with the fabric of reality. And what we want to try and show you is the kind of the way that some of that leans. So maybe we'll talk about Augustine a little bit, and then try and cover some of the other period.
Well, I just want, you know, first of all, Clement of Rome, this is something, that quote, this mutual communion thing, something that Karl Marx would be like, toss that.
Oh, yeah.
That's rubbish.
Yeah, of course.
Rich people and poor people we need a revolution. We need to smash the landowners, and the rich and the poor need to overtake them. That's always been like, yes, the church absolutely has a preferential option for the poor, but not in a way that has ever been promoted as like start the revolution and like upend society and destroy like all, you know, like nobody should be, you know, we certainly don't encourage the possession of goods for their own sake. But I mean, like, if somebody has been gifted by the Lord to own a particularly fruitful piece of land, and he, you know, sells the produce of it and makes a lot of money, that's God's gift to him, you know, and you can take that to its modern interpretation, but that's something that he's called a responsibility toward. Yes. And that the poor who benefit from that excess produce, who work the land, are called to celebrate it as well. They're not the owners of it, they're not just stewards of it, but they're beneficiaries of it too. And that's always been something that has really, especially in the modern age, pinpricked ideologues who are just like, no, I have a theory. This is how it works, and I'm going to just flatten society to look a certain way. Yeah.
And I think, you know, for whatever their faults might be, there's contemporary people who have extraordinary wealth who recognize the responsibility that comes with that. And not all of them do, and maybe the ones that do, they're not doing it perfectly. The Gates, for instance, have billions of dollars that they're trying to give away. Warren Buffett is trying to give away his fortune, before he dies, and set up foundations and whatever. And I mean, the Gates, the way that they distribute that money, I object to some of it. Yeah. But the fact that they're not simply grasping onto it is impressive. I have no idea what the responsibility would be like of having $90 billion and trying to say, well, what can I do with this that's good in the world? I mean, I hope I would do something, but it's hard for me to imagine just saying, I'm cool. I only need one of those billions and the other 89 I could give away. So that's
you're right.
Those people that get it at least a little bit. And I think with whatever money I have, can I be as generous can I be partially as generous as, wealthy people? So there's a richness to it. But so one of the things that I think is a really good sort of guiding thread for this whole conversation about this long period, all the way to 1800s, is actually Augustine's framework in the City of God. So
here we go.
St. Augustine's 4th century, lives during sort of the waning period of the Roman Empire, and he writes in the City of God a theology of history, right? It's not trying to tell you the story of the Roman Empire, even though that's his immediate context. He's thinking about a theology of how the world history advances. And he says basically that there is, in the course of human affairs, 2 cities are entangled together within the world, and they're intermixed until the last judgment. And that's the city of man and the city of God, right? And the city of man kind of looks down, looks here. It's like Hopper at the beginning of Stranger Things. He says, my daughter understood galaxies and stars and all that, and I figured there was enough going on down here. I didn't need to look anywhere else. That's the city of man. You're looking at the here and now, what you can see, what you can grasp. Yep. And grasping is really key, right? It's basically the fall shows us a really good instance of the city of man. Rather than giving, you want to take. Rather than limiting, you want more. And you want to be God ultimately. So that's the city of man, which I think it's easy to see all the problems in the world. That's the city of man. The city of God is what's God's effort to reach into that city of man and draw us up and out. So the city of God looks up, looks to God, and is about the love of God, the love of neighbor, and the love of self. Right? Those 3 things that are upturned in the fall are the foundation for the city of God. And really, it's the city of God in a certain way is how creation was established, quickly falls, and then the rest of salvation history and actual history is the story of God slowly trying to affect translating or transforming or transcending the city of man back into the city of God by his own condescension, by his incarnation, his death and resurrection, and then sharing the gifts of grace through the sacraments, through the leadership of the church. Right? That whole process marks human history, salvation history, and it shows us in a very particular way in the various social arrangements that exist throughout human history. Better and worse attempts at that. Times when there's success, times when we let the power get a little bit, it corrupts in some sort of way. So there's very interesting parallel between human history and I don't mean to suggest that salvation history isn't human history, but if you look, for instance, at the role of Israel in the Old Testament, right? It's supposed to be a light to the nations.
A lot of time on.
Yeah. Supposed to be a light to the. I'm pulling a lot from this book by Andrew Willard Jones called The 2 Cities. So if you're playing the at-home game, you can follow along in the index of that book. It's fantastic. He's at Steubenville, and he's written just actually a trilogy of books about this basic idea. Anyways, he sort of shows the Israelites are supposed to transform the world around them, right? So they're given by God special gifts, covenants, they're given law, liturgy, and they're given all sorts of teachings on how to live with justice in the world that they are in, so that they can show other people and invite them into that. They're not just like hiding out and closed off. This isn't a quiet place. They're on the farm hoping that no one sees them, just trying to survive. This is going out actively, trying to draw others in. And as they go about that, sometimes they get a great leader, things start really cooking. You know, I mean, think of Solomon as the primordial example of this. He's got all of the riches, all the wisdom, everything's flowing, and he begins to sin. And then he just goes really nosedives, and the power sort of corrupts him. Things fall apart. You could also think earlier about the judges. It's this sort of cycle of a little bit of fidelity, their heads getting too big for us, and then, we fall apart and we need another. So that whole concept of the battle or the contest between the city of God and the city of man, I think is a really good framework for thinking about this long period between the patristic era and, the 1890s.
That's right. So the last episode, we tried to make the point that the Old Testament, this God apportioning his chosen people, a certain section of the world, to order all of society, so that, again, they're not even working with, there's not even a distinct revelation in most of the Old Testament that there is an eternal life, that there is an afterlife. The law is to be applied to our day-to-day, and Israel is this light to the nations where you're supposed to see the reordering of creation as it's supposed to be.
Yes.
Sloppily lived out. The difference, the logic maintains the same, which is God desires to set aside a city for himself, a city of God. But in the Christian dispensation, the church doesn't get a tiny little corner of the world.
Right.
We don't get, we have the Vatican City State, but that's not part of the original blueprint, right?
Yeah.
It is, Christians are sent out as leaven to the whole world. Now you're let loose, and this grace follows you anywhere and everywhere. And so that's Augustine, his really, like, as this becomes a crystallized form, especially as the church takes a definitive shape after the persecution's end.
Yes.
We're prominent parts of society. We're sometimes even the most privileged parts of society. We have a symbiotic relationship with the Roman government by the time he's around. Some controversies and Arianism is brewing, but all these kinds of things. But, just in his lifetime, 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius not only said that Christianity is to be tolerated like Constantine, he said the Catholic religion is the official religion of the Roman Empire. So this is happening in his lifetime. And he sees in this germination of a true structure of the city of God in the church especially, is supplanting the city of man in a pretty definitive way.
Yeah,
this is happening.
Let's talk about Theodosius. The encounter with Ambrose.
Yes.
This is a really good example, right, of the difference between the Roman Empire prior to some of the emperors converting and the church. Yeah. Right now, they're bound together, as you said, kind of closely in ways that I don't think a lot of us understand or might weird us out. But in any case, in, say, Caesar Augustus's time, Caesar is God.
Yep.
His will is God's will. He is to be worshipped even. There's liturgy to be offered. There's sacrifices and oaths to be sworn. By the time you get a Christian emperor, the emperor is not demanding sacrifices made in his own name anymore, but he's still very powerful. Andrew Willard Jones makes the case in the book here, a pagan person, so a non-Christian person in the Roman Empire during a Christian emperor's rule would have still pretty much understood the emperor to be like God. Because for a pagan person, or anybody in particular pagan, let's just not the Jewish people wouldn't probably see it this way, but let's just say for your typical Roman pagan who is just kind of a whatever, who's just kind of going along, power is what made a god. And Theodosius had incredible power.
Yes. Right?
So he would have kind of had a natural way of being understood as a god, even though he didn't say that about himself. But this episode with Ambrose, you want to tell the story about
We're talking about wielding tremendous power. He's still the emperor. There's an uprising in Thessalonica in Greece. He orders the slaughter of the inhabitants in the scale of tens of thousands of people are killed at his command. and he wanders back to Milan in one of his little trips and wants to go to Mass.
Yes.
And then what happens?
And Ambrose stands outside of the cathedral like Gandalf and says, "You shall not pass." Like, you're not coming in here because I know what you did.
Yeah.
You didn't. War is one thing.
Yeah.
You slaughtered innocents. You got to do penance before you come. You can't even walk in here until you do penance. And there's a sort of special responsibility that he has as the emperor to demonstrate what Christianity really looks like. Yeah. And so that's unthinkable in a Roman Empire 70 years prior, that an emperor would bend the knee to merely a bishop. I mean, he wasn't even the Pope.
Not the Pope. He's
just, okay, you got me. And he did do penance and then later, reconciles. That is a seismic shift in two ways. It's a huge shift or departure from, the Roman Empire of Diocletian or whoever. And it's very different from the way we think about politics and church today, right? I mean, when President Biden was still in office, there were people clamoring about whether or not he should receive communion or not. And whatever side you take in that debate, nobody got him to say, you know what? Maybe I have some things here that are a little scandalous, and I'm going to go ahead and do some penance and come back and see if the church will forgive me. I mean, he didn't, I don't know his soul. I have no idea what the state is, right? But Emperor Theodosius, I don't know how to say his name, he did very publicly repent. Yeah. And so that's just
crazy. It cannot be understated how seismic, like you said, a seismic shift this is, and that the empire, like, that the state had already kind of shifted into a mode of like, this is how, despite our long glorious Roman history that goes back to you can go to Romulus and Remus if you want to, but clearly, the history of the Punic Wars and Caesar and Augustus and all these, the Pax Romana, that all of that dominance that had coalesced in the personage of the emperor, was so quickly undone to where the emperor can now, in a normal state of affairs, that nobody been like, why is he doing what the bishop says? Like, yeah, you know what? Christ is in charge now. The representatives of his on earth are the bishops, and even the emperor has to submit and say, mea culpa, mea culpa. An incredible story to look at. We're not even scratching the surface. I would encourage, if you've never picked up the City of God, it's not one of those like, oh, I'm going to take a book to adoration or like for a little prayer time, just have some spiritual moments. There's so much where Augustine just flexes his intellectual muscle and shows that he has memorized all of pagan history. And he basically is just like line by line telling you your version of society, Rome, especially to the pagans that still were around. Another caveat there. The way of Christianity dominating the political landscape, as the persecutions of Christians ended, there was not then a subsequent persecution against pagans. Their temples were slowly closed down, but they were not rounded up and made to submit to Christ and, or be killed or something like that. And that was already such a different way of society. Like, your victory does not necessarily entail a revenge tour, right? That you just integrate these people slowly but surely. So anyhow, Augustine just shows basically the reason why the Roman Empire ultimately was falling apart at the end of his life, especially, is because the inherent weaknesses of the pagan world and its whole ordering away from the living God. Like, your problem is not just like you don't have a big enough army or you don't have enough money. Your problem is you don't worship the right God, and therefore your whole society is just, it's going to fall apart. It's going to fall apart, and they were seeing it before their very eyes. Now where do we go? Augustine dies in 430 AD.
We're doing good.
And we're
only got 1400 years.
Some of our big highlights. So, when I say the word or just the word Christendom, What do you think of? Because this is what we're entering into.
Sure.
The long Middle Ages, the medieval period leading into maybe you could say up until some say the Middle Ages lasted until the Protestant Reformation, for example, or the discovery of America. It's a huge amount of time, and it is dominated by this idea of Christendom.
Yeah.
What do you think of? What's always been your impression, or how's
Christendom seems to me to be about a great unity of the church, sort of across Europe. That there's a clear structure, a clear authority. So the office of the Pope begins to function much more like we think of it today than maybe it did in the 300s or whatever. Not that there wasn't a papacy, but a clarity to what the structure of the church is and how that works kind of everywhere, and a close unity with political power, particularly in France, where the French government in a particular way kind of enters into a friendly relationship with the church, not demanding the right to appoint bishops, but recognizing the Pope's authority to do that, but also asking those bishops to serve in what we would call civil functions.
Yep.
So I am no historian, but at all. Andrew Willard-Jones, in his book describes in this time period bishops kind of acting like judges on a local level, and thinking of the fact that the emperor is or the king or whoever, I guess it's probably a king, has this huge territory. No one's going to see him for the most part.
That's right.
He has very, very few things he actually does, but people respect him, and that's important. And that the Pope functioned in a similar way for the church. Like, you're not going to see him. The bishops and the nobility are kind of so it's this time in which the local people respect and obey these figureheads, or they're not merely figureheads, but these leaders far away, but that the local, so that there's a subsidiarity, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
That's right. Yeah.
That the local church functioned very well under the guidance of a bishop, and sometimes the bishop had civil responsibilities, related to, well, I don't know what, taxation or other things.
Yeah.
So that's, again, I'm no historian. I can't even play one on TV, but that's what I think of.
Well, that's a great example. So you're in your average village in Western Europe for a long time, and you think of, like, in my world in Pensacola, if I have a civil problem, there's a whole apparatus that is entirely secular that I can send my grievances to, or there's a constable that it's like most of the time, if you were in one of these places, the people that would adjudicate a civil dispute was a cleric. Sometimes it would be they may be royally appointed or something like that, or appointed by the local nobility. But it's like the people that are really governing what we would call secular society on a day-to-day basis are it's a true partnership and of church and state. Of
so there's a unity of the spiritual authority and the temporal authority.
Yeah. With great friction sometimes, and then unfortunate moments, and but also that this is something that we often talk about, like where does the great hallmarks of Western civilization, universities and hospitals and orphanages and all these kinds of things. This is just basically the church in its place, and Christians, and not just the church. The Christian society has been so deeply imbued with the biblical worldview, with all of its foibles and messing it up and all these kinds of things, that it just naturally gives rise to social projects and social realities that draw man higher and higher and higher up.
Yeah. One of the things that Jones talks about is that through the conversion of first the Roman Empire and then later Europe, the mass conversions began to show in a particular way the wealthy and the noble classes, people with money and resources and power. It gave them a different sense of what they could do with that. Yeah. So where in the Roman Empire the wealthy elites would fund the state religion or build a temple to whatever, some god, then they when they become Christian, they say, well, I've got to give this to the church. So John Lateran and St. Peter's Basilica were gifts of wealthy converts, right? That not, and that's not just given a building or some land. It's like, here, you can have this land. I mean, these places became mega epicenters of the church and of the reimagination of what the world could be like. He talks a lot in the book about like building worlds.
That's right.
And has this really fascinating idea that like a craftsman that makes doorknob handles has actually much more finite control. Like he controls 100% of what that doorknob handle looks like, how it works, what size it is, what shape, all that. A city planner is supervising a much larger area, but has in a real way has less power because it's just all this abstract, broad stuff. But the artisan has like this extreme level of power and control over one thing, and he sees that as sort of a vision for what the world looks like through the lens of the church. That the Pope he does have real power, but he's not hearing a confession, on the other side of the world and witnessing to a drunk somewhere that should be converted. That's happening through the ministry of a local parish or a local pastor or another Christian. So there's this sort of inverse thing about how wide your power is versus how total it is, and then how total your power can be, but it is very limited. And those work together. In that similar way, the church and the state worked together in Christendom in these different projects that were seen as part of the same thing. And we are Americans don't like that very much.
this is like the perfect example. It's like we think of, especially let's go on that craftsman, like your local artisan who's just making a living for himself and his family, but trying to sanctify the world as well as provide a means. We still have that around. We see all these beautiful people across our diocese and our parishes who donate time and their expertise, and they try and make beautiful things and help people in whatever way they can, because they're motivated by maybe whether they're around here, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, they're motivated by this kind of city of God mentality. We don't have an inherent idea that the people at the apex of society now are motivated by this. We might think, they have a private Christian life, but when it comes to their public action, whether they're in the private world or in the public sphere, they're going to operate by the demands of the age and the demands of the secular things that drive us and stuff. But in the medieval world, especially you think of something like, when you talk about a craftsman, something like a medieval Gothic cathedral. That is a result of every level
all
of society. All the
levels of society.
From your artisans who are making the door frames, to your artists who are a little bit more, to your architects who are way up on the chain, to
the people paying for it.
And to the people paying for it.
And which was not only the wealthy, incredibly super rich. That's part of it. It's the state, and it's the poor. Even the poor that had nothing. We can't imagine. If our diocese builds a new church and we say it's going to take 8 years, even 8 years, I think would be very unacceptable to Rob and Bishop and David L. They'd be whoa, we can't. That's way too long. These churches were built over hundreds of years. You have to have an entire world that sees the value of that and gets that it's not really about the money. It's not even about the time. This is about the glorification of God, right? That's something that I don't know if we can do anymore, because we're in a completely different world. So this battle, this sort of it is a battle in some ways between the city of God and the city of man, but it's also sort of a meandering kind of going from one back into the other, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, maybe 5 steps backwards, 3 steps forward sometimes. You see this winding its way through the wars of religion, through all of these things. The Protestant Reformation is a really big moment where it's really, really interesting the way Jones narrates that the Reformation, that Luther was trying to kind of get away from the church, and he gives power to princes, and in so giving power to princes, he actually makes the church, even his own church, weaker. Because he turns over too much power to the princes, and the princes just kind of in Germany and elsewhere, wherever the Reformation took off, kind of saw it as a chance to break free from Rome for purely different reasons. They can keep the tax money. They can appoint their own bishops. And so even Luther's own church stumbles immediately into a world that it doesn't recognize because he was trying to kind of get out of a world but stay in it, and he couldn't. He created a new world. He went back to a city of man in attempting to sort of make a new city of God, not in God's image, but in sort of his own image. And not mean to be mean to Luther, but this was a fascinating account in this book.
You mentioned the wars of religion. There's, there's the Latin phrase "cuius regius, cuius religio."
Yeah.
Right. So, whose kingdom it is determines
whose religion.
Whose religion. So, in that time, that meant basically, are you going to be a Lutheran, a Calvinist, or a Catholic?
Yeah. And
that is just kind of like, that is such a revolution from where we go from the apex of the medieval period, where all of Christendom is Catholic. We've separated, unfortunately, from our Eastern brethren.
Sure.
There's a whole history there as well. But the church has triumphed in many ways through the Gregorian reform and just the triumph of the papacy in many ways, but not because of conquering, but just a collective feeling or vibe that we should kind of, that's our point of reference, that slowly whittled itself away, and that the secular power was never quite okay with the church being the dominant kind of dictating form. And there were, you see these skirmishes between, like you said, over taxes a lot of the time. For example, the church has always kind of maintained, if we think tax-exempt status is a new thing, it's not a new thing. No. It was always a point of contention. Pope Boniface VIII, he wrote a famous letter called Clericos Laicos, and just basically to the French clergy, saying, if the French king asks you for taxes, you don't pay. We don't pay nothing to nobody. And that's like literally like the whole substance of a papal bull. But we get to this point where this absolutist mentality, where over the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries especially, the city of man, even if it's Christian, has reasserted dominance in a way that has in many ways defenestrated the church's impact on society. Probably the crystallization of it is in the French Revolution and a moment like Napoleon Bonaparte. If you don't know, guys, Napoleon Bonaparte took the Pope prisoner and held him there and gave him, I think it was Pope Pius VII. Yeah. That sort of thing was just sort of, we would think about like, somebody took the Pope prisoner? Maybe that happened during the martyrs. The early Christian periods. No, Napoleon, who wasn't a great Catholic by any means, but would have grown up in this Christian.
I think you can barely say, if you take the Pope prisoner, you're certainly not a great Catholic.
But the rest of the kings and queens of Europe were like, that wasn't great, but yeah, we can kind of do what we want,
Yeah. So the idea of sovereignty, Jones actually says, is almost like a perfect example of just taking steps straight back to the Roman Empire.
That's right.
Yeah, the political idea of well, that's a sovereign king, and you can't go on his land. You can't force him to do anything. He has this divine sovereignty, this divine power. He said that's like a really unfortunate corruption of the concept of power that's only capable when you're clearly moving away from union with the church and into something different, and that it looks suspiciously like the pagan conception of a king, of a god king, but that like it wants to not be that, but it is.
and there are two striking historical examples from this period. We have on the other side of the aisle, we have King Henry VIII, who does the most egregious thing and declares himself the head of the church in his territory. I am the King of England, therefore I am the head of the church in England. But so that's part of the Protestant Reformation. But guess what? Louis XIV, the famous Sun King of France, who reigned for 70-odd years, maybe the most famous king of France of all time.
70 years?
70 years.
Wow.
I think it is. It's
I did
absurd.
not know that. Was he like 12 when he became king or something?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I think,
Dude, I don't know nothing about history, man.
He did.
Chez is giving me a history lesson today.
He did. He remained a Catholic. He remained Catholic his whole life, but he essentially did the same thing while remaining Catholic. This is where we have the idea of Gallicanism, or
Gallicanism,
Gallicanism, which is basically in France. Yeah, I'm Catholic, but I don't take cues from the Pope about who the bishops are in my Catholic France. I determine these things.
Yes.
And that you might call yourself Catholic in many ways. Maybe you go to Mass and participate in the sacraments. Hopefully he's in heaven. But that is exactly the pagan city of God mentality. I rule over all else. And everything is kind of consolidated for the wider good and the common good and stuff, but also to solidify my throne, my absolutist reign. And this is something that's just absent from that church father phase, that early Christendom phase.
Let me. I know we're at probably way over time, but let me try and as you were talking, just something kind of came to mind that I think might be a helpful way to kind of wrap up. So this idea of Louis XIV that he's powerful, and of course he was. But that his power extended to anything that happened in his territory, right? This concept of divine sovereignty, and that kind of hard crystallized authority over everything. Say, I'm going to choose the bishops. It tries to make one part of the world, the secular part, it tries to make it into everything. Mm-hmm. It tries to identify everything with one thing. Whereas what the church has wanted to do, in some places did well, is to allow there to be a distinction between a temporal authority and a spiritual authority, but to assert that we certainly do need both of those. Mm-hmm. We cannot have just one.
Nope.
Even a monastery can't do without some punishment.
Yeah.
I mean, what would a monastery be without punishment,
But we are not theocrats either. We are not theocrats.
That's right. So that there's a necessity for both of these things, but in the right order. And that order is going to mean practically a lot of power for the temporal authority, but in the order of metaphysics or ontology, it's the spiritual authority that has the final say over the most important things. Mm-hmm. So as you were describing Louis XIV, selecting bishops and kind of pushing the Pope away, I kind of thought we're both fathers. Mm-hmm. It would be like if you were, as a father, trying rigidly to determine your children's interests, their passions, their style, what music they like. It's one thing this is a really good example, a very good practical example. It's one thing as a father to say, I'm not going to let you listen to this specific artist or song because it's just not appropriate for you, versus saying, I need you to love the same kind of music that I love. I want you to get excited when you hear the greatest hits of the Canadian brass come on. I want you to go, oh yeah! Is this that original 1970s recording of the Bach fugue before they added the extra horn parts at the end? I can't expect that of my children, right? So that's I think that's I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that was kind of coming to mind. Like, if you tried to rule your household down to these most minute details that everything's going to be exactly the way you want it, you're killing real freedom in the false name of trying to assert power and unity. And that's where in the modern world, and we'll see in Leo as we get to Leo XIII, that was taking a real new form.
Oh, yeah.
And this necessitates the church kind of teaching social doctrine in a different kind of way because it was a different kind of world.
That is the perfect analogy to lead us into.
Yeah.
We will see, guys, we're going to do a little more history leading in, but next episode is on the granddaddy of them all, Rerum Novarum, as Leo looks at this world, which is clearly adopting the first seeds of totalitarianism, exactly the dad you described, in something like the Communist Manifesto, a total reordering of society in its entirety, a flattening of it, and then in some capitalist excesses, and some other excesses around the excesses of absolutism we talked about here, that Leo will sit back in his chair and survey and make an intervention that will change papal teaching forever, and honestly will change economics and politics as a thought forever. So that is episode 3. Catholic Social Teaching, the granddaddy of them all, Rerum Novarum. We will see you back there in a few months' time, actually. But between that, we will see you for the next episode of Gaudium et Spes with Bishop Bill on the Council of Nicaea Part 2.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Gaudium et Spes podcast. If you would like to know more about our podcast, please visit our website, gaudiumetspes.net, or go to ptdiocese.org and click the button that says podcast. If you listen to the audio version from an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched us on YouTube, Be sure to like and subscribe or leave us a comment there as well. Thank you for joining us.